Hello, everybody. Good morning. So this second panel of the day is, as Geisha just said, malicious state and non-state actors. Who are they, what do they want, and why? Before we get started, I've been asked to do a couple of items of quick housekeeping. So can you please remember to have your phones on silent? Not the last time you'll hear that today. This panel will last for an hour, and there will be no audience Q&A, but there is the opportunity to join the conversation on Twitter. For that, the hashtag is DisinfoWeek, or one word. So for those of you I haven't met, my name is Jack, and I cover cybersecurity for Reuters news agency across Europe, Middle East, and Africa. Part of my beat is looking at influence operations and disinformation, so I have some experience in this space, and indeed working with some of the people on this panel today. Speaking of our panel, I'll just run you through quickly who's going to be part of the conversation. Here on my left, we have Lee Foster. Lee runs the Information Operations Analysis team at FireEye Intelligence, and his team specializes in identifying cyber-driven nation-state influence campaigns and non-state actor hacktivism. He will be speaking today largely about his experience dealing with actors from Iran and the Middle East. Moving on, we have Jakob Kolinsky. Jakub joined the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center last year and is currently a non-resident senior fellow focusing on disinformation. In this capacity, Jakub says his aim is to raise awareness about pro-Kremlin disinformation campaigns, and those will be the actors he will be speaking about today. Daniel Milo is a senior research fellow at the GLOBSEC Policy Institute and also a former advisor on countering extremism to the Slovak Minister of Justice. His focus today will be on some of the more interesting groups in this space, which are those non-state aligned actors, particularly focused on far-right and far-left political groups. And last but by no means least, fresh off a transatlantic flight, is Shanthi Kalathil. Shanthi is Senior Director of the International Forum for Democratic Studies at the National Endowment for Democracy, where she says her work focuses primarily on authoritarian challenges to democracy in the information age. And today she will be speaking about the role of China in the information space. To start things off, we have an opportunity for each of the panelists to open with 5 to 7 minutes of kind of initial remarks. And Lee, since you're here, would you like to start us off?
Happy to. Thanks for having me, Atlantic Council. It's great to be here. So, as Jack mentioned, I run a dedicated team of intelligence analysts at FireEye that's focused on identifying, tracking disinformation campaigns online, and this is a kind of natural extension of the work we do tracking intrusion activity from hostile state actors. What I want to talk about today, very briefly, is a kind of summary of an Iranian operation that we uncovered last summer, published and has since received a lot of attention from other researchers, unmasking more and more components of this campaign, and then talk a little bit about some of the broader implications I think about when I look at what we saw in the Iranian context. So what did we find? What we uncovered was a extensive network of what we would call fabricated news sites, because fake news has become such a politicized term, but news sites masking their true origins, hiding their identities, focused on pushing Iranian state propaganda to audiences all over the world. And these sites were accompanied by very elaborate networks of fake social media profiles that we use to push content from these sites to specific audiences. And I mentioned all over the world. I mean, we're talking not just the US and UK, but we saw sites targeting Latin America, countries in Africa, the Middle East, Asia, Indonesia, Russia, and so on. I mean, this was really a global exercise here. The content was pretty basic, but very much in line with Iranian state interests. A lot of anti-Saudi material, a lot of anti-US material, anti-Israeli material, pro-Palestine material. And so this was a big clue to us in terms of the unusual nature of these sites and these accounts, given the purported identities that they were actually adopting. To give you one good example, we uncovered a network of social media accounts that were purporting to be left-leaning progressives in California that were heavily promoting pro-Iranian content. And it's kind of unusual discrepancies in the actual material being promoted and the identities or the purported identities of the individuals pushing it that can often be a good clue into instigating further investigation into those sites and those accounts. One thing that was interesting was pretty soon before we made our public announcement about this network, we saw some of the accounts actually shift to what we might think about as what we've seen a more traditional Russian model of adopting personas in an attempt to actually try to influence domestic politics within particular countries. So to give you an example, one of the sites we were tracking was a site called Liberty Front Press, and what we saw from some of their social media accounts is around June, July of last year, they completely changed their identities to align themselves with progressive movements in the US. One account calling itself the Berniecrats, taking on this identity of being a Bernie Sanders supporter. We've also uncovered sites that we believe to be in Iranian origin that align themselves with the Black Lives Matters movement. Again, this is a technique we saw from Russia. So to me, this is a curious kind of observation, this shift from pure traditional state propaganda to what appears to be efforts to actually potentially influence domestic politics, in a specific country. And so this makes me think about to what extent are different state actors learning from each other in this process. As Russian activity is unmasked, how is Iran looking at that and adjusting its own tactics? And then consequently, how is Russia adapting its tactics? Some broader implications of this activity that I wanted to speak to. There's kind of two or three here. First, I wonder to what extent this might become the new norm of this type of activity. And why do I say this? We found no links to any sort of what you would classify as hacking activity, intrusion activity. Right? There's no real cyber dimension to this in the same way that we saw with Russia. Of course, Iran has those capabilities. We track extensively Iranian intrusion operations, but we found no linkages between those and this disinformation network. And this, I think, presents important implications for how we think about tackling this type of activity. And I'd kind of point back to Ambassador Fried's remarks here about how you need policy approaches to deal with this, because this activity is not prosecutable. Right? When there's an intrusion, you have a specific crime that you can go after. There's some sort of entity agency that will have jurisdiction to pursue a criminal complaint against that. That does not exist in this same kind of space here. So I think that's an important thing to think about there. And kind of linked to that, given the heavy emphasis of news sites behind this Iranian campaign, and what we're seeing with Russia as well now, with the creation of the USA Really site, a sub-site of the Federal News Agency, these kind of gray area entities that push disinformation, propaganda, but mask themselves as news entities. To what extent does that inhibit our ability to tackle these and take them down if they can claim defenses aligned with freedom of the press and so on? So this is another important kind of implication I think about having unmasked this. I'll leave it there for now, Jack, but I'm happy to follow up with additional questions.
Thank you. Jakob.
Thank you. I'm really happy that we actually have a panel specifically on malicious state and non-state actors, because I had the pleasure to work with Giles, who was sitting in your chair just a few minutes ago, and I've been a part of many debates here on the EU level. How do we tackle actually this problem? How do we counter the trouble of disinformation? And I was a little bit frustrated that far too often the debates were mostly about repairing our weaknesses. So let's raise media literacy and the problem will go away. Let's support journalists and fact-checkers and the problem will go away. Let's ask social media to do something, and most people in Brussels actually do not know what they are asking from social media, and the problem will go away. And the trouble is, the problem will not go away. The trouble is that we face, in the Kremlin, we face an aggressor who will keep looking for new and new weaknesses, no matter how many weaknesses we repair. And we've seen it already happening in many places in Europe. I'm not saying it's not important. Obviously, we have to focus on media literacy, even for our own sake, no matter whether we have Kremlin or Iran using information weapons. But it will not make the problem go away. We've seen that the Kremlin really adapts its tactics and strategy based on the audiences they are trying to influence. Social media might have been the most important tool during the US election campaign in 2016. It is a tool that is not that important in Central Europe. In Central Europe, you would face much more chain emails that are spreading disinformation from those fringe websites. In English, you know, Zero Hedge or Infowars, Breitbart, whatdoesitmean.com. You would have 40 of these pages in Czech Republic, 40 of them in Slovakia as well, 80 of them in Hungary, 80 of them in Poland. And the senior population, they are sending each other chain emails with this kind of information. And you know, when you receive the disinformation from a friend, it's much more trustworthy than if you find it on the internet. They tried opening Sputnik offices in Scandinavia. It didn't work. They had to shut them down, most probably because, yeah, the media literacy in Scandinavian states is higher than, for example, in Central Europe. That doesn't mean they would leave Scandinavia. They shifted their focus on trolling on social media. The worst case of trolling in the European Union we know about is the Finnish journalist Jessica Aro, and manipulating the comment sections under established media outlets. So the trouble is that this is the nature of this aggressor. If we go and answer the questions that are in the title of this panel, what do they want and why? Yeah, the Kremlin wants to keep doing this because it's actually their only option, this constant weakening of our position. What do they want? They want to undermine the West, they want to spread confusion, they want to amplify divisions, either use the existing ones we might have. So, for example, during the recent Czech presidential elections, it was mostly divisions between the capital and the countryside, between the old generation and the newer generation, between better educated and less educated, between people with better income and worse income. Or they can even invent completely artificial divisions. So for example, this artificial division of basic human rights being in a contradiction with some undefined traditional values, which actually in Russian understanding means something like, I can beat my wife whenever I want. That's the traditional value they try to promote. So they try to find the divisions on the most strategic level, be it between the US and Europe, be it between particular European member states, but also on a micro level, like within one particular society, you can try to find some issue like the Polish-Ukrainian tensions, Polish-Lithuanian question, or the anti-Western sentiment in many countries. They will keep doing that. And why? Because it's the only option for them. There is a nice distinction how we in the West understand public diplomacy and how the Kremlin understands it. We understand it as a non-zero-sum game. We can have more attractive Slovakia and more attractive Czech Republic, and nobody loses anything. We just gain. This is not how the Kremlin sees it. Somebody's gain equals my loss, and my gain means their loss. What do you have to do in a situation when you can't improve your own position? And Putin is exactly in that position. He's been there 20 years, and he's ruining the country. People are running away. That's the fresh report of Atlantic Council about the horrible brain drain of Russia. The emigration from Russia is now at the levels of it used to be in the 20s during Lenin's and Stalin's early term. So he hasn't reformed the economy in 20 years. He's still dependent on oil. He's really ruining the country. He has to shut down the hospitals. He has to cut the expenses on education and shut down schools. the only two chapters that always receive more money are army and the media, because most probably because media are part of his army. So what is the only option you have when you can't improve your own position? You have to weaken your adversary's position. He will keep doing that until we stop him. So I think that the trouble we face with this particular malicious actor, if we do not stop him, and if we just focus on repairing the weaknesses, we will keep having the problem. And I also think that given our Western weak reaction towards Russia's aggression, we have actually encouraged other actors to use the same weapons, like Iran. We have shown that we tolerate this, we have shown that we do not punish it, and that means that more malicious actors are using these weapons.
Thank you, very interesting. Daniel.
Yeah. I very much welcome to having such a panel combining the role of state and non-state actors. And after excellent Alina's presentation, she made a very compelling explanation of why actually the non-state actors play a very crucial and important role in Kremlin's toolkit. And you know, I've been following different extremist movements for more than 15 years. And when I remember back in early 2000s, you know, these were really closed groups lurking in dark corners of the internet, like Stormfront, you know, behind password-protected access, where ordinary people never ever ventured, unless they really were interested in those really fringe political groups. Nowadays, you know, 15 years on, we have a number of the same people whom I've been following for more than 15 years, sitting in national parliaments, in the European Parliament, and we tremble with each and every election in the EU, but also maybe on the other side of the Atlantic, whether finally the dominoes would fall and whether the anti-system political forces would actually trigger a major change in orientation of a given country. You know, we have two European governments, one in Italy, one in Austria, where junior members of the ruling coalition have official cooperation agreement with Putin's United Russia. This is, you know, unheard of in modern history. And next June, when the renewal of Russian sanctions would come to vote in European Council, you know, many things could happen. And if you look at this issue from a broader perspective, this is one of the key reasons why Russia decided a long time ago to support these fringe political movements, be it on the far left or far right, in order to achieve its broader geopolitical goals. And when I think about, you know, what has happened in these 15 years, why those fringe political voices have come to the mainstream, you know, definitely the impact of social media and the early adoption of all the opportunities that are provided by social media, by those fringe political groups, is of crucial importance. They have been early adopters. And I looked at some of the metrics, if you just compare, for example, the number of likes and followers of, say, AfD in Germany versus the CDU. You know, the AfD, despite the fact that it has 3 times less votes in the general elections, is outperforming the CDU by far. And this goes, you know, if you look at any European country and compare the two kind of components, on one hand, the fringe political movements, be it far left or far right, and on the other hand, the traditional political parties, unfortunately, the fringe is doing much better. One part of the explanation is that, yes, they are early adopters, they know how to use social media to its fullest potential. The other half of the answer is that there is astroturfing, there is bots, there are trolls that are helping to create an impression that actually their online presence is much bigger and their footprint is much bigger than it is in real life. And this is where actually the Russians come into play. And if you study the relationship between far right, specifically to a certain extent also far left, and Russia, it goes back to Cold War. In 1950s, Soviet Union back then was supporting, you know, kind of post-NSDAP parties in Germany, and this has been continuing up until today. And with the revival of Russian imperialist, let's say, doctrine, the use of political parties in different countries is kind of one of important parts of the agenda. And why do they cooperate? You know, how would you reconcile sometimes very conservative political actors who have been anti-communist for the great part with Russia and its strategic goals. Well, I consider this as a kind of unholy alliance. You know, there are many commonalities, kind of using the principle, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and at least for the time being, in some countries it seems to be the marriage of convenience, in other countries it's marriage of passion. Really, there are people who have been vocal supporters of Putin since his early days, even before it became very popular. In other countries, it's really just a strategic alliance. And without us looking into and analyzing really deeply those connections, because they go well beyond the information space. As Alina said, you know, there is political party financing, there is strategic corruption, there is economic pressure, hacking and providing of compromat, as Russians call it, meaning information that is able to compromise particular political candidates. This whole is a spectrum, and therefore I try to look at those issues from a perspective of hybrid threats or hybrid warfare. So this is really a strategic, very complex operation that if we want to push back against those efforts, we really also need to think strategically. I consider this to be a kind of a revival of a culture war, that, you know, there is this alliance of domestic and foreign actors trying to push back against liberal democratic order, using all means at their disposal to create cleavages, to sow confusion, to polarize our societies for their own benefit.
Thank you, Daniel. And Shanthi.
Thank you. So, you know, Jack asked us to talk a little bit about the main title of this panel, which is Who Are They and What Do They Want? So in the case of China, it's pretty simple. The who is the Chinese party state. And what does the Chinese party state want? It wants to make the world safe for the Chinese party state. And one of the key avenues that it exerts influence through and tries to achieve this goal through is the global information space. But I would argue that it does so in a way that is distinct and is perhaps unique among authoritarian actors in this space, because unlike many others, I don't believe that the Chinese government is trying to necessarily harness asymmetric power. I think it's quite confident in its growing power and its ability to not simply manipulate or play democracies off against each other, but to really affect the fabric of the information space itself. And it brings to bear all of its instruments in doing so, including leverage over its own private sector and international businesses through influencing build-out of infrastructure, and increasingly through the development of platforms and technologies that will shape the way that democracies function for the foreseeable future. So let me just make 3 quick points. The first is that I think to date what we've seen or what we've heard when we hear about China is this idea that the Chinese government is trying to export authoritarianism around the world, and that by developing its own intensive surveillance capacities at home, particularly in places like Xinjiang, where up to 1 million people are now incarcerated in camps and are massively surveilled through a truly fearsome combination of different technologies. The argument is that the Chinese government is taking these surveillance techniques and exporting them to other autocratic governments around the world. And in so doing, it's strengthening these autocratic governments. And while I would argue that this is a part of it, I would say it's not the whole picture. And I think if we only think in terms of how China is exporting authoritarianism, we also miss the piece where it is actively trying to weaken democratic institutions through the information space. And let me just give a couple of examples of that. For one thing, I think everybody is familiar with the system of Chinese censorship, which is generally known as the Great Firewall. Within China, information is censored. International platforms, media platforms, and so on are not allowed. And the type of information that people are allowed to access is not simply limited, but highly manipulated, so that there is a variety of content, but none of it is designed to encourage going outside what might be seen as a safe sandbox. What I would argue is that as Chinese enterprises have grown, as the Chinese government has increased its scope and its ambition, it seeks to take this type of model globally. And it does so through influencing the platforms themselves. And we've seen examples of that through recent pressure on Western platforms who have been asked to develop censorship tools for the Chinese market, but also to the development of its own homegrown technologies and platforms. And one area where we see this is in development of, for instance, messaging tools like WeChat, which is now being increasingly popularized around the world. And I almost see this as an evolving alternative information ecosystem. So while we have these norms and regulations, and increasingly people are trying to understand how to clean up the information space in democracies, either through regulating existing platforms or some sort of measures such as Jakub was talking about that I know you're a bit skeptical of, maybe media literacy and so on, I see an evolving alternative information space that is powered by authoritarian governments where they have full access to people's data because they have essentially created legal and technological loopholes to gain that access. And they can freely, and to my mind, in a very non-transparent way, manipulate the types of information that appear on those platforms. And increasingly, that's not relevant just to the Chinese domestic space, but all sorts of places around the world, and not just in the Chinese language either. The second point is that I think that the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, has been thinking about the strategic use of information for a very long time. There's a word that it doesn't translate very well into English, but it's called informatization. It's a bit unwieldy, but it essentially means the incorporation and strategic deployment of information in every sphere of politics and society and economics. I first heard this term a few decades ago. I hate to say that, but I mean, back when China really wasn't an information power. It was really just starting to develop these capacities. And yet, at very high levels, people were already thinking about how to strategically use information and use that information to maintain the Chinese party state's primacy. The new wrinkle is that there is a new term, and the new term is intelligentization. Again, in English, quite unwieldy, but the practical implications and ramifications of that are that the Chinese government is really thinking holistically about applying new tools like artificial intelligence, machine learning, collection of big data, and so on, and seamlessly integrating that with perhaps some of the information acquired through cyber intrusions and so on, into a massive database that can then be used worldwide. And I think we really are only beginning to see the ramifications of what intelligentization means. And this is what really keeps me up at night, unfortunately. And that leads me to my third point, which is I think that democracies around the world have really only begun to grapple with this issue. I think primarily, unfortunately, a lot of these issues with the Chinese government and technology have been cast purely in strategic or economic competition terms. I really think that a huge implication of the development of these types of technologies is in the democratic space. And this is of consequence not just to the large established democracies, the Western democracies, but vulnerable and struggling democracies around the world where they don't have the capabilities to really deal with some of these complex issues. There are also ramifications for democratic institutions and governance, such as in the realm of internet governance, where the Chinese government has been much more active. So my takeaway from all of this is that I think not only is it a slightly different frame than when we talk about what the Kremlin is doing, but I think democracies have to get a lot smarter and a lot faster in really thinking through the long-term implications of China's rise in this area.
Cool. Thank you very much. So we have just over 20 minutes now for a slightly more free-form discussion. And Jakub, I'll throw the first question to you, because I know this is something you and I have discussed in the past, but why do you think it's specifically important to analyze the motive the motive as well as the actions of these actors?
Well, first one, it's just a vocabulary definition of the word disinformation. It's an intentional spread of false information, meaning if you analyze the intention, you also have to analyze the actor. If you do not analyze the actor or the intention, you are analyzing only false information, nothing else. That's why I'm actually not 100% sure that fact-checkers are 100% of the solution to the problem of disinformation, because they usually analyze only is the information false or not, but not the intention why the false information is being spread. Second, I think in order not to propose disproportional solutions, we have to be aware what are the aims and goals of the person or organization spreading this information. It is really different if we have 400-pound kid lying on a bed, tweeting false stuff about the best president the US has had. And it's different if we really have a nation state who has a long-term strategy, probably more long-term in the case of China than in the case of Russia, which might go bankrupt in 10 years. But I think, yeah, the threat is much bigger if you intend to basically destroy the way how the Euro-Atlantic space functions. That's a really big difference than if someone is spreading false information just for fun.
Okay. And Lee, one of the things you mentioned in your opening remarks was that there are some marked differences between what you saw the Iranian groups doing in terms of pushing essentially Iranian-aligned propaganda messages compared to what we've seen from Russian-linked actors, which was a lot more kind of an offensive action aimed at destabilizing and creating divisions in society. Do you think that speaks to a difference in motive, and if so, how should that inform our understanding of it? And then leading on from that, some of the stuff you saw later in the campaign, right, was this beginning of an overlap with the Iranian groups starting to mimic or at least take on stuff we've seen linked to Russian groups. So does that indicate or speak to a kind of perhaps a change in motive as the campaign developed?
Yeah, so I think to address the first part, it's not just a case of necessarily different motives, but different actors as well.
Okay.
And who's actually taking on a lot of this activity. In the Iranian context, there's been public statements made by some of the social media companies saying that they could link this activity on the back end to Iranian state media. So, this is an extension of their broader mission, whereas in the context of Russia, some of the most aggressive activity has obviously been linked directly to the GRU. So I think that's important there in addition to the motives. As I mentioned earlier, I think there's a feedback loop going on here.
Okay.
As actors continue to learn from each other, what appears to work, what doesn't, and so on, they adjust their tactics. They change things up. We see that in the Russia context with, how different Russian activity looks today compared to even in two years ago. In terms of less reliance on false personas and so on that analysts can very easily pick apart, to a greater reliance on amplifying kind of legitimate conversations online and things like that. And I mentioned earlier, moving towards this kind of, news-based approach as well that Iran leveraged. So I think there's learning going on there. And, the actors will adopt whichever kind of toolkit they believe fits the particular aim or goal that they're trying to achieve. Again, we don't know in the Iranian context because the whole thing got blown open as they were changing it up. So, we don't know what otherwise could have been. But it did seem to indicate that they had decided they wanted to at least experiment with a more active role in terms of trying to specifically influence policy discussions, domestic politics in a target country, rather than merely kind of boost perceptions of Iran and kind of, weaken impressions of Iranian adversaries.
Yeah. Do you have any kind of particularly prevalent examples of that off the top of your head?
Of trying to influence?
Yeah, I guess so.
I mentioned before the whole Bernie Kratz adoption of these progressive left personas, and some sites affiliated with Black Lives Matters and so on, I think as a potential indication there that they were, potentially experimenting with how could we influence, domestic politics in a specific country.
No, and I think this idea of a feedback loop, as Lee called it, and these different actors learning from each other is really interesting. And Shanthi, it seems to me that China has taken a remarkably different approach, perhaps, in this space compared to some of the Russian and Iranian and fringe-linked groups that we've been speaking about. Do you think there is scope for Chinese actors to learn from some of these other groups, or vice versa, these other groups to learn from the Chinese approach?
I do think there's tremendous scope for the Chinese state and linked entities to learn from the approach of the Iranian and Kremlin actors, because I think that they are dedicated to trying to perfect all these different techniques, especially as they expand overseas and develop their own platforms. That's the space that I find most interesting.
Right.
And one thing that I'd heard earlier is that the Kremlin developed some of these techniques after first refining and perfecting them within Russia and trying to use these techniques on its own population, and then started to apply them effectively overseas. And I'm wondering if China is looking to perhaps mirror that as well, because of course, domestically, China developed its own techniques. But I think it's also one lesson that it's learned from the Kremlin is that it is distressingly easy and low cost to implement some of these very disruptive techniques. And I absolutely expect that there's at very least the interest right now, if not the exact capability to do so.
Yeah. Do you think it's happening already, or is this something you expect to see more of in the near-term future, or perhaps more long-term future?
I think, it's hard to say. So, for instance, if you talk to people who study disinformation in Taiwan, they say there's absolutely evidence of Chinese government meddling in the information space in Taiwan using similar techniques. I think outside of the Chinese language space, it's a little bit harder to discern. And people have said, well, what they're trying to do doesn't seem that effective so far. But I think as Chinese platforms themselves rise in importance, and you can already point to a number of them that are now spreading around the world. Who's to say who is manipulating those platforms? I think if they have a link to the party, there's all sorts of potential for mischief there.
Are there any particular geographic areas which you think would merit attention in terms of this?
I mean, I would have originally said primarily in areas where there's a large Chinese language speaking population, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and so on, are places that China feels are strategically important. But actually, through acquisitions and other means, Chinese companies now own many major platforms, including, there's one that's been in the news recently called TikTok, which is being used by people all over the world, youth all over the world. I think there's not so much knowledge that that is owned by a Chinese company, and that Chinese companies, regardless of what it says in the terms of service, at some level are unable to defy the party if the party comes to a company and says, we need you to do X, Y, and Z. So if you look at that chain there, it would make me, start to look a little bit more at the presence of these types of platforms in many different countries.
Okay. Daniel, the three other members of this panel are kind of representing groups that have been linked to nation-state entities, whereas you obviously have a slightly more diverse playing field in terms of the groups that you're talking about. Do you think we can analyze and compare the motive of non-state groups in the same way as we talk about nation-state actors? Are there any kind of dangers or challenges in that approach?
Well, since there are so many of them, it's harder to distinguish between individual reasons for particular behavior, since they're much more fragmented. On the other hand, what I see when I study those movements and the way that they communicate, you see kind of overarching narratives and overarching principles. And many of those actually do coincide or are in sync with the meta-narratives and the meta-approach of certain state actors, mainly Russian Federation. Just to give you a few examples. One of them being the attack on independent media and more increasingly NGOs. You know, the situation in Russia where you have very restrictive legal regulation against NGOs, you know, labeling them as foreign agents. You know, this approach has been expanding to a number of Central European countries. Hungary is a good example of that, but there are similar examples in other countries, and far-right political groups are at the forefront of such effort. So you can see clearly kind of one particular approach which was used and developed in, say, Russia, to be picked up and amplified in other countries. Another one is the support and intentional spreading of conspiratorial theories, conspiracy theories. And, you know, why and what does this has to do with disinformation and with geopolitical goals? Well, available academic research shows and proves that people who tend to believe in one conspiracy theory are much more likely to jump on a set of other conspiracy theories. There is also this red pilling effect. Some conspiracy theories, such as, I don't know, vaccination causes autism, is used as a kind of an entry point to other more geopolitically focused conspiracies. And this is the same approach that I've seen applied time and again by different political groups that say, well, you know, there is this world conspiracy that tries to poison your children and to, I don't know, decrease the white population, which is a typical right-wing conspiracy theory. And from this point, you know, people are easily brought into a wider kind of geopolitical set of conspiracies, which again are in line with Russian geopolitical interests. So we see that this is a very fluid and interconnected field where one actor is actually able to export some of the measures and narratives to be kind of naturally picked up and used by different actors in their local setting. Maybe just one last remark in this round of questions. I think that sometimes we make an error when we discuss the role of non-state actors, assuming that there is some kind of hierarchical order or kind of that those groups are on Russian leash. That is not necessarily the case. Yes, there are cases such as the funding of Front National and some other clear-cut cases. On the other hand, you know, my feeling is, and kind of what I learned, is that there is much more of a ideological alignment. So not necessarily looking for direct kind of command and control type of relationship, but rather, you know, we have mutual interests. Why don't we work together? And if we can make some money on the side, which is kind of on the case, you know, the more the better.
Is that a conscious partnership, or is it more kind of the reality of circumstances?
Well, on many occasions, this is a conscious partnership, and you know they're happy to work with Russia, or you know, be it China. If China would like to support those groups, I think they're more than happy to jump on this train, despite you know all this talk of Chinese influence. On the other hand, you know, those groups have very concrete political agendas, and whoever is supporting their cause, you know, they're happy to use them as a tool to further their interests. Right.
And in terms of like ideologically, you know, defined and motivated groups, can we? I mean, there's been a lot of talk about what the far right are doing and the far left, but can we really say that the disinformation practices are restricted to fringe politics any more than they are, you know, in the so-called center ground as well? Well, increasingly, those narratives and those approaches are entering political mainstream. And well, again, I can use my own country, which recently we had a major kind of societal movement following a murder of an investigative journalist and his fiancée last year, which in the aftermath led to removal of the prime minister from his office, who in turn interpreted those events as, you know, a conspiracy led by some foreign actors. He named George Soros to be kind of, you know, the puppet master behind all this, which is really, again, unheard of in recent Slovak history, that a prime minister would really use conspiracy theories to explain his removal from office, which was really an outcome of a huge outrage of ordinary people with the level of corruption and inability of state authorities to properly investigate the case. So yes, you are right that this is not the domain, unfortunately, anymore of the fringe political actors. But what I see is
kind of mainstreamization and mainstreamization of this type of discourse and those narratives, and entering wider and wider spheres of political life and attitudes.
Jakub, you wanted to follow up on that?
I just wanted to say that I actually believe that the relationship between these smaller non-state actors who might be spreading pro-Kremlin or pro-any dictatorship disinformation, it will be asymmetrical with these state actors. So perhaps not everybody spreading pro-Kremlin disinformation is directly paid by the Kremlin, obviously not. On the other hand, the Kremlin and its embassies and its proxies are instructed to use these elements because they know that this is precisely what will weaken the society. I mean, and they are very explicit about this. Dugin, whom some would call the brain behind Putin, and some would say that it's vastly exaggerated. He had a nice interview in already 2012. We do not connect people based on for what they are, for what you are. That only divides people. You are Jewish, you are Muslim, you are Christian. That divides people. We connect people based on against what they are. Are you anti-NATO? Are you anti-EU? Are you anti-US, anti-mainstream? These attacks on NGOs and on media, what do they have in common? Attacks on any solid information sources as such, and this is precisely what Kremlin wants. So I think the relationship might be really asymmetrical. So the people who are used by the Kremlin, they might not even know that, but yeah, Kremlin and its proxies, they are definitely doing it intentionally.
Lee, is there anything you've seen in your experience around Iran and other actors in the Middle East, this kind of either formal or informal collaboration relationship between non-state groups and state-linked groups?
We have historically in Iran anyway in the intrusion side of things. The Iranian state regularly uses contractors to carry out a lot of their cyber activity, and so we've tracked individuals, for example, that have been linked to an APT group at one point and then engaged in financial crime or hacktivism at another time. That's actually pretty common in that context.
I'm aware that, so we have kind of 4 main groups represented on the panel today, but do any of you have any suggestions or ideas about, groups or nation-state linked actors that perhaps could have been or should have been represented on this panel today, outside of Iran, Russia, China, and the extremist groups?
Daesh?
Oh, yeah, very interesting.
Maybe just to add one particular topic which was not really covered is the international networks of those fringe actors, like the far right and far left, because yes, we try to look into how are those actors connected to state actors, but there is an ongoing, very intense internal cooperation and internal communication. And I think it was also highlighted in the previous panel that kind of the manuals and approaches developed, say, in the US by the far right are then picked up by European far right parties. Just to give you a very quick example, the meme Pepe the Frog, which originated in US 4chan environment, is now used, and I've seen many, many examples in different European countries, so this kind of using of narratives and methodologies and tools developed within one particular country by the fringe non-state actors jumping to a different continent, to a different cultural context, and being used for the same purpose.
Okay. We have just a few minutes left, so I thought just to round this off, we could perhaps start at the other end and come along this way, but Shanthi, starting with you, what are the main takeaways you would like the people in this room to have from our conversation today?
I think this panel is focused mainly on what you might call the supply side of disinformation.
Okay.
And, and I think what will come through perhaps in subsequent conversations is a little bit more about what happens on the other side of that equation. What is powering this? If not for the embrace of these types of disinformation and a wholehearted ability to believe in some of these things, none of this would really spread or take root. And again, I've looked at the Chinese censorship and information system within China for a number of years. I think there's a misconception there that it's this arid space where there's no Facebook or Twitter and it's really boring. And it's not. It's incredibly vibrant and dynamic and designed to keep people within that system and consuming it and not wanting to go outside of it. And I think that's mirrored a little bit in what you might call well, what Ambassador Fried, I know, is referred to as the demand side of disinformation. And it's, I think we have to also think about why all of these techniques are successful.
Yeah, my main takeaway would be when thinking of the connections between state and non-state actors, we really should be thinking broadly. We should be thinking not only about the information aspect, but taking into consideration all the other vectors of influence, from financial to support by providing, say, intel or by exerting pressure, because all these other factors are at play. If you focus only on our fringe political actors using kind of the script from Russia, we are missing the picture, and also our countermeasures, if you want to push back against those efforts, are not going to be effective. So we should really think broader, use kind of the hybrid threat type of approach, and a comprehensive approach when we try to address those issues.
Okay, thank you.
I think that to the toolkit we use in order to counter this problem, and I'm sorry that I sound sometimes skeptical about media literacy. I don't mean to say that it's not important. It definitely is. I'm just saying it will not stop the Kremlin from spreading disinformation. So I think that we really should add to the toolkit punishing the aggressor, really on the most strategic level. Vladimir Putin is a liar. He was lying that there are no troops in Crimea. He's still lying that there are no troops in Donbass. I don't think world leaders should be treating him as an equal. Sergei Lavrov is accusing Angela Merkel of hiding under the rug the problems that migrants are raping underage girls in Germany, which is a lie again. So other foreign ministers shouldn't treat him as an equal. Vladimir Solovyov, who has 3 times per week his hate show where he accuses the US and the European Union of all the evil on the earth. After the show, he sits on the plane and enjoys his villa at Lago di Como. How is that possible? How come that the biggest advertisers on Russian media are Western companies? Why are we paying for the anti-Western propaganda? And really, even on the more tactical level, punishing the journalists who are spreading lies. I really think Clint was actually talking about it on the previous panel. You can't really shout fire in a theater. How come that whenever I open these pro-Kremlin websites, they are accusing the government of plotting a terror attack against its own citizens? Mm-hmm. This is really spreading false alarm. How come we are not punishing this behavior? Inciting hatred. We have paragraphs on this in many countries. Why aren't we using them on these actors?
Sorry to just jump in, but do you not think that runs the risk of us ending up, in a world with at least 2, if not multiple, different information spheres, effectively, kind of as Shanthi was talking about with regards to China, and what the risks might be of that?
How would that come? Or how would that happen?
I guess essentially, if you're saying, so to phrase the question back at you, do you have any specific suggestions of how to enforce that punishment? And the Russian government is already under sanctions. And do you have any suggestions of things that you think would actually change the behaviour?
I think we haven't tried it yet. So yeah, I would hope that it might change the behavior. It is how we, how we punish the criminals. If the first punishment doesn't work, then we have a tougher punishment. Mm-hmm. If it's not enough that you've been in prison for murder for 10 years, then you are going for 20 years, and then you are going for life. So if it's not enough that we have punished a few Russian companies, then we have to punish more. If it's not enough that we have punished a few Russian individuals, we have to punish more.
Okay. Lee, I'll leave with you for some final wise words.
Perfect, thanks. So, 2 things that I think would be a takeaway. One is mine, and one's kind of a shared theme we've heard already today that I think should constantly be reiterated. So firstly, I think it's important not to look at this threat purely through a Western lens. And when I say that, and I think it speaks to your last question, right? We're up here, we're talking about Iran, we're talking about Russia, we're talking about China, because we're concerned about how are they trying to influence Western audiences. And it's important to understand there's a lot of actors out there that are playing on a more regional basis, and it's a mistake to overlook that, and it can be downright dangerous. And a good example of this is a case you're familiar with. You've written on this, but people in the audience may not be aware. One of the Iranian sites we identified, AWD News, posted a fake story claiming that the Israeli foreign minister had threatened Pakistan with a nuclear attack, something ludicrous. And the Pakistani foreign minister picked this up and actually tweeted back a threat at Israel. And now that was subsequently corrected, but it goes to show that, you know, this stuff can spin out of control very, very quickly. And as far as we can tell, that's not some high-level, you know, Iranian official that's deciding, this is a narrative we should push. It's some low-level employee in a state media organization that's, you know, taken the first step to triggering a nuclear conflict. So we have to be able to, you know, look beyond just how does this affect us, but how does it affect all countries and politics between them. The second thing, Rachel mentioned it earlier, Alina mentioned it subsequently, I'm going to mention it now, and I hope it's mentioned on every panel going forward. But you cannot think about this solely through the prism of elections. If you look at this as like, okay, we've got an election in 2 months, what do we need to worry about? You've already lost, because this is the slow drip, you know, of influence that just seeps into society. You know, over years, that's why it's very important that you don't kind of, you know, drop the ball and look away when there's not an election coming up, but set up, you know, some sort of capacity to track, identify this activity on a continuous basis.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. I've been asked to remind you that following our lunch break now, the next session will start promptly at 1:10. So I hope everyone has a good break, and would you please join me in thanking our panel?